You ready? Are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we've begun recording. Okay, all right, everybody. So welcome back to my channel. I am the Black Carnivore, and I am here with Arian tonight.
Hey.
Yes. So normally we do a live stream at this time, but what I decided to do instead was to premiere a recording that I did with Dr. Robert Cywes, who is otherwise known as the Carb Addiction Doc. And I thought that I would premiere that tonight so that we could have, the whole community watch it. And then Aria and I will be in the live chat, because when you do, I don't know if you're familiar with YouTube, but when you premiere a video, a pre-recorded video, it plays at a certain time, and there is a live chat going on at the time that the video begins to play. So what we're going to do, we're going to be in the live chat, and we'll be answering questions and chatting with everybody. And then afterwards, we will do a live chat then, and you'll already be on my channel, so you'll be able to find the new live stream. And we're going to talk for, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes afterwards, talk about what we heard and, our opinions about it, and continue the conversation. So I encourage you all to come on and make sure that you watch us. And if you're watching this in the replay, I will connect the next live stream that we do after this to this video. So when you watch to the end, you'll be able to see that. And also, so Dr. Cywes and I had such an interesting conversation that even though we tried to wrap up multiple times, we continued talking. So the first time you hear us wrap up, don't stop, because it's not over. There's more to come. Yeah. All right. So I don't want to hold this up too long. I encourage you to enjoy the conversation. Join in on the chat if you're here live. If not, continue the conversation down in the comments below, and I will see you after. All right. Okay, so let me do a quick introduction. So welcome back to my channel. I am the Black Carnivore, and we are doing the Black Carnivore Podcast. We are actually taking a slightly different direction than we normally do. Normally, the podcast is really people just giving their testimony about how the carnivore diet has helped heal them, from whatever their concern or their issue is. But I want to make sure that we're providing information that is, up to date, accurate, helpful for people in this community. So I invited Dr. Robert Cywes. I did not say that right either way.
Oh, it's all good. It's all good. I'm not even sure I say it right.
Okay. Otherwise known as the Carb Addiction Doc on Instagram, to come on and talk to us about a whole bunch of things. So I really appreciate your being here. And if you don't mind telling us a little bit more about yourself. I know you have a practice in Florida, but and you focus on, is it pediatric bariatric surgery?
Yeah, I focus on carbohydrate addiction, and we have I'm fortunate enough to have a whole range of aspects and angles that we can treat it with. The backstory is both from a medical and a scientific perspective, a clinical perspective, as well as a personal perspective. We have some pretty deep insights into obesity, metabolic disease, diabetes, and really the eye of the needle being chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. And we've had to unwind a lot of dogma that has been entrenched in our society in an erroneous fashion, either because of evangelism or simply because of economics. And both of those things are really, really difficult to unwind, because there is no incentive at a societal level to change the trajectory that we're on. So we have to go back to protecting ourselves as individuals, as small groups, and kind of experiment with ourselves to find what works for us, and come to that understanding with certain guidance, because you and I are going to be dead of old age before the world turns this corner. with all the knowledge we have about smoking, if we're still selling cigarettes as a society, if we're still telling our society that vaping is absolutely fine, it's perfectly healthy, and 40 to 50% of our high school kids are vaping actively, there's no way on God's earth we are going to deal with carbohydrates, obesity effectively in our lifetime. And that's just the sad truth. But as individuals, we can understand the science, we can be introspective about who we are and how we function, and we can try to improve and do the best we can to be as normal as we can given who we are. And that's really my objective. My objective is to help people along that journey. And the more we can help people to understand their own health, the better. That's really my background. Yeah. By the way, I topped out at 300 pounds. I've lost about 98 pounds as I sit here. So I share that journey in an ongoing fashion. There is no end point to it. So that's the personal story. I have a PhD where we looked at this type of thing. I continue to participate in scientific studies on this. And also clinically, this is what we do for adults and kids, both conservatively as well as with surgery.
Okay. So why would someone go forward with surgery? I mean, do you recommend that people try the keto or carnivore diet, and do people start that and then continue to go on and get the surgery as well?
Okay, so the first thing is this: the worst thing somebody can do up front is have surgery. About 98% of diets, whether they are keto, whether they're carnivore, whether they're cookie diet, whether it's the cabbage diet, Weight Watchers, Dr. Oz, it doesn't matter. 98% of diets fail. And I'll throw out a little personal thing here. We were talking about community. As wealthy as she is, as invested as she is in the space, Oprah remains fat and metabolically sick. And it's because she has tried to lose weight, not deal with why she gained the weight in the first place. So if we look at someone who is most likely to succeed like her and see her struggles and see her failures and see her pitfalls, think about the fact that surgery is going to have the same result. About 85% of people that have surgery fail. And it's very rarely because the surgery fails. It is almost always because people have surgery as an alternative to a diet to lose weight, to get healthier for a little while. And surgery almost always does that. There are very few people out there that have surgery that don't lose a massive amount of weight. But this isn't about weight loss. This is about understanding and addressing why we gained the weight in the first place. And surgery is merely a tool to help people along that journey when they are struggling on the journey. It isn't as an alternative. So surgery is a valuable tool. Who should get surgery? Surgery is a valuable tool for people who've really, really tried hard and understood what it is they're treating. They're treating a substance abuse problem, not a calorie problem. And if they're struggling with that, surgery is a useful tool to use along that journey, particularly when you trip over your own feet very often. Nobody would deny a heroin addict methadone. Nobody would deny, except insurance companies, by the way, would deny a smoker Chantix. I get those denials all the time. They want them to quit smoking, but they won't allow me to prescribe Chantix. That's a separate story. So weight loss surgery has asset value along that journey. The second thing is that weight loss surgery has a life-saving capacity for people who are really brittle diabetics that are almost on death's door and really need a rapid turnaround. If it takes you 2 to 5 years to lose your weight to get healthy, but you're going to die in the next year or two, to steepen that curve, to accelerate the slope of that curve, that's the other place where weight loss surgery helps. but it really should be an asset or a last resort or a tool that you use rather than something you do as an alternative. And that's the way we approach it.
So the people who've gone ahead and done it would, you know, I mean, we do have people who, you know, a lot of people, in fact, who have had the surgery between the 90s and the present. So for that population, is the carnivore diet a good choice for them, or are there, like, you know, specific things that they would need to do differently?
Well, I think there's two parts, irrespective of surgery or not. Okay, there are very, very few people who woke up this morning and said, "Oh, I'm fat. I need to go on the carnivore diet." Almost
true.
everybody, right? Everybody that comes to the carnivore diet, because realistically, it's pretty radical. It's pretty way out there. So you don't just suddenly wake up and say, "This is what I'm going to do." Same thing with surgery. You don't suddenly wake up this morning and say, "Oh, goodness, I'm fat. I need to go and have surgery." By the time you get to the threshold of a carnivore diet for obesity, by the time you come to make the decision that to entertain surgery, you are pretty much an expert at failing weight loss programs. So you get there as kind of toward the end of a journey or out of frustration that other things haven't worked. Even if you've lost weight, you haven't been able to keep it off. So the two, while they are similar, they're also distinct. And I would tell you that if the carnivore diet or a carnivore foundation to your diet, and that's an important concept to discuss, but a carnivore foundation to a human diet is the proper human diet, as my friend Ken Berry likes to refer to, then everybody should be on this as a foundational element. If in addition you're then trying to lose weight, if you're trying to get rid of diabetes, if you're trying to deal with cardiovascular disease, there are other tools that you can add to that. So my submission is that an omnicarnivore or a carnivore way of life, with carnivore in capital letters, the omni being in small letters, that really for me is what defines us as human and as progressive in the evolution of being human. So does that make sense to you? Does that help you a little bit? And
yeah, I mean, in our group that, you know, we've had to come up with some language to, you know, sort of figure out how to talk about the way that we eat. So we kind of define it by strict, moderate, and relaxed. Strict being just, you know, meat, eggs, you know, fat, water, salt, and then moderate, you know, people might include avocado some days or olives some days and dairy. And then relaxed, people might include some artificial sweetener and so on. So it's a spectrum from, you know, strictly carnivore to more keto. But, you know, it allows people to have some flexibility. Some days, you know, they do some things, some days they're more strict, and, you know, they can kind of figure out from there their personal program.
Right. And I think, you know, with a little bit of caution, I would flip that completely around. I would look at what you're trying to treat or trying to correct or trying to establish through your diet and understand why you arrived where you are and what dogma works and what dogma has failed. And from my perspective, we really have three concepts when it comes to eating things that aren't necessarily the healthiest for us. We've got use, abuse, and addiction. And so instead of looking at in terms of its strictness, because that's a personality defect that can cause problems, and I'll discuss that briefly. I really want folks to be able to look at who they are and what they're capable of doing. One of the things that we look at is if you look at how old you are. I'm in my 50s right now. I want to live to 100. So what I do now has to last me for the next 40 plus years. It isn't just something I'm going to do for 6 months or 3 months to lose some weight. If you talk to a vegetarian, do you have a vegetarian friend? They don't say, oh, I'm on a vegetarian diet. They define themselves arrogantly by what they do. I am a vegetarian. So when you offer a vegetarian a steak, they don't say, oh, no, I'm not allowed to have that. How the hell can you kill a cow, you bad person? They're arrogant about the fact that they are vegetarians, and that keeps them going. So if you're going to do carnivore, it's going to fail. If you are carnivore, it's more likely to succeed. And you've then got to understand who you are. The worst thing you can try to do, if your underlying problem is authoritarianism, is to try to be on a highly structured, very perfect diet, because therein lies the problem. If you have obesity or type 2 diabetes as a problem, by definition, if you want to explore this, we can, by definition, you have a carbohydrate addiction. Nobody gets 5 DUIs and is not an alcoholic. Nobody gains weight to the point of morbid obesity or type 2 diabetes and tripped and fell over and landed face first in a tub of ice cream. That is some serious, dedicated use of carbohydrates year in and year out as their primary excessively used emotion management tool that eventually resulted in obesity and type 2 diabetes. And by the time you have reached that diseased metric and distorted the reality of the harm that that type of ice cream does to you every day so that you can give yourself permission to have some, you no longer have and never will have. You no longer have and never will have control of your relationship with carbohydrates. And the two single worst things that diets do is, number one, they deprive us of our best friend without replacing her with somebody better. And number two is they ask us to very tightly control a relationship we do not have the capacity to control. And that is not feasible or possible in the long term. So you've got to understand where you're coming from. If you're an otherwise healthy person, you can have a broader range of things. If you have the obesity, the type 2 diabetes, you maybe want to be a little bit more strict in terms of dealing with this from an addiction perspective using substance abuse methodology. Because the goal here is to correct why you gained the weight in the first place, not just to correct the excess weight. And this is what people don't understand. Ultimately, obesity and type 2 diabetes, the root cause of those is a comprehensive deficiency of effective emotion management strategies. And we then fill that void in our lives with a dysfunctional relationship with a ubiquitously available substance that instantly gets us high. Whether that is heroin, whether it's nicotine, whether it's alcohol, or whether it's carbohydrates, those are the most prevalent dysfunctional relationships that we currently have. Now, there's others, pornography, that type of thing, that all have merit, but can all be used in a dominant, exclusive, and excessive way to the point of harm. So the issue is not the diet, the issue is the relationship.
Well, I appreciate you making that distinction. And, yes, that is a regular conversation in the community as people, certain people do feel that they do have a good control of the substances and they can have them without detriment. And others of us, have to be more strict, including myself. I also have a number of autoimmune problems, which means that I do better when I'm exceptionally strict. And I recently just took out coffee and spices and that sort of thing. And I have definitely noticed an improvement. So, for me, I just need to be more strict, but that is something we talk about. But one of the other things that you were talking about that it makes me think about what we're doing. We really do need to have a lot of support. I think that eating this way is like the best way to eat, but it is so different from what's going on in the rest of the world, in our communities and in our homes, that those of us who are choosing to do it really do need a lot of support. So to that end, we have a Zoom group that meets 3 times a week to provide, like a group coaching essentially, and just like support for people to say, hey, you're not crazy. There's somebody else doing this. And we have a Facebook group too, as well, to provide that same amount of support. So, what is the importance of building that kind of community in terms of providing support for people? What have you seen with your people?
Well, I think there's support and there's knowledge and education. And the support is there as one of the fundamental, I call it an effort-based emotion management system, one of the fundamental aspects of people who are recovering from addiction. And there's no question in my mind that this is as much an addiction as alcoholism. So when an alcoholic goes to an AA group, it is for education, it is for support, it is for empathy. And the support group, by definition, should never be judgmental or critical. It can be binary. Addiction management is binary. You either did or you didn't. And I've never, by the way, when you say there's some people that can eat some carbohydrates, I've never met an alcoholic who can drink 2 beers a day. I've never met someone who only uses heroin on Tuesdays. So if you're telling yourself you can, if you've been obese, if you've been diabetic or are, and you tell me you can have a little bit, you're conning yourself. I call that a relapse. And that for me is a very, very important distinction, because in 22 years of doing this with tens of thousands of patients, I've never met somebody who could sustainably maintain a relationship with a substance they're addicted to and not get into trouble. They may be fine for a while, but when life throws an emotional curveball at them, what resources do they have? So when you're talking about the groups, they are there as part of an empathetic, non-judgmental support system to offer you emotional buoyancy at a humanistic level. And it's not compassion in terms of it's okay to screw up. It's also not punitive that you made a mistake. It's there to help you to, number one, recognize when you're making mistakes, and number two, to develop strategies as to how to resolve the mistakes you've made. Once you've made a mistake, it's in the past. You cannot correct it backwards. But you can make sure, because you're probably going to be in a similar circumstance again, it's to make sure that you develop a plan now so that the next time you're in a similar situation, you can protect yourself from that damage. So support is invaluable in that regard. And when we talk about compassion, we want to define where we are perfect and where we have latitude. In an authoritative setting, you've got very strict boundaries. And then there's latitude within those boundaries. And you can set that latitude wherever you want to. I do consume dairy. I do consume coffee. I do those things because there's no evidence objectively of harm from those things. But you set that threshold based upon where they cause harm. I do, from time to time, enjoy eating vegetables. But I don't have them in my house. I am a pure carnivore at home. But if I go out and they have some vegetables, I'm not going to say, oh, no, not at all. But the absolute boundary for me is carbohydrates. No carbohydrates. Because once I cross that threshold, that's a problem. That's what works for me. I've got patients who are strict carnivores. I've got patients who are lacto-ovo vegetarians. But if they transgress in terms of eating sugar and starch, that's problematic. The other place where a support group helps is Remember, we're talking about authoritarianism, but there's a separate subgroup, which are permissive people. So an authoritarian person is trying to dismantle structure. In an authoritarian setting, we have been raised with ridiculously lofty expectations. And no matter how much effort we put in, we're always falling short of those expectations. And you really want a group that offers the compassion that doesn't have those predicted outcomes. At the same time, if you come from a permissive family background, you lack structure. And what those folks need is external structure to sustain an action. And support groups are incredibly useful for people that come from a permissive background where they have somebody else riding the same train. They have someone they can lean on. They have somebody, almost like you have a relationship where there's somebody there to help you through the tough times. Because we don't screw up when times are good, but we screw up through the tough times. And if you've got that support, that person to lean on, and you know 3 times a week you're going to show up at that support group, you're going to show up. But if you have to show up for the person you see in the mirror, maybe some days a permissive person doesn't show up. So it depends on the personality type, and you're really looking for a blend of personalities. And then the final piece about a support group is we really have to meet each person at their own capability. Authoritarian people tolerate austerity very well, but they crash and burn. So they tend to be the rabbit in the rabbit and the tortoise fable. Whereas permissive people do much better taking little baby steps on a regular basis, but they need guidance to take those little baby steps. You didn't become fat or diabetic in a day. You don't have to start a carnivore diet tomorrow and be perfect. If you begin progressively with help to remove certain things from your environment, progressively over time, with the end point of getting to carnivore, it becomes much more tolerable. So the value of a support group is in its diversity and in the dynamics of that diversity with a common goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, so it's a choice. This is not something anybody has to do. This is something we choose to do, and eventually it becomes something we can't not do.
Yeah. Well, right now we have, a pretty tight-knit group that is pretty determined. So, and we're getting, new people every day who've kind of heard about the carnivore diet, and it's sort of been mulling or percolating around in the back of their heads for some time, and, finally decided to take the plunge and give it a try. So, we have a mix of people who have been doing it for years and people who are brand new. So I would love, and for the people who are brand new, I feel like, there's just a lot of information that's being shared out there right now. Some of it helpful, some of it I think is really not helpful. And so, I've tried to kind of sift through that information and present a plan or a way to do this in the very beginning that can help people just get on the track and get through the transition. And then, from there, they can start to figure out their own way and personalize it for themselves. So what would you say are the most important things for, to deal with getting started and some of the early transitions problems? Right. Particularly being able to digest fat and protein.
Right. So I think the first thing is distance yourself from the word diet. Diets and especially people that look at what the best thing is, we're moving away from something. We don't want to be super normal. And all too often people offer you things that you have to have because they're super normal, and this thing is terrible. Progress at that level. However, never have a calorie metric. Calories are irrelevant on a carnivore diet because the human body will never, ever let you overeat meat. There are certain built-in hormonal feedback systems that prevent you from overeating meat on a regular basis, which is an important concept to understand. At the same time, and here's where the conflict comes in, is that we human beings are the only species that through our lifetimes preordain how much we're going to eat, and we then try to get that amount in because somebody told us we have to eat 4 eggs a day or whatever it is. So in order to return to your normal biology, the metric that gives us stopping feedback is fat, saturated fat. And the time to stop eating is when, not when you're full, but when you begin to feel full. And what you want to do is to trust the fact that it's kind of a little queasiness. It's not like I'm stuffed. We use caloric or gastric distension or calories or portions because carbohydrates don't give us satiety feedback. So we have to have a metric of stretch receptors in our stomach. Learn to understand how fat makes you feel. And as you begin to feel kind of, hey, you know what, I'm getting to be enough, stop there, because the fat continues to be absorbed. And if you then continue to eat, even though you can, you're going to feel really queasy, you're going to feel miserable, and you're not going to like the effect of a carnivore diet. You can always go back for more if you need to, but almost always you will not need to. So stop eating when you begin to feel full, no matter how much you thought you needed to eat. And almost always on a carnivore diet, there's going to be leftovers. And quite frankly, one of the best things for me is I found my dog wouldn't eat lettuce as a leftover, but he will eat hamburger or steak as a leftover. So that's the first thing. The second thing to understand is that a snack is always an emotional event. It is never a nutritional event. A snack is like desire for a cigarette. You're doing that opportunistically for your brain, not because your body needs to eat. The value of being carnivore is we get a huge bang for our buck occasionally when we eat meat so that we can go off and be human for most of our day. If you're a vegetarian, cows have to graze all day long to get enough in. So basically their entire existence is spent grazing and running away from carnivores. So therefore, as you fat adapt, you can get to a point where you only eat once, maybe twice a day. And that's enough. You don't start there, but you work your way to that. So a lot, the other sexy thing apart from carnivore out there is something called intermittent fasting. That's and a Jason Funk friend of mine, it's absolute garbage. Intermittent fasting happens when you're not eating. And the thing about fat is that fat will make you full early, and it'll keep you full for a long period of time once your body fat adapts. So all you've got to do is to learn to trust that you won't die of anorexia between meals. And you can stretch out those times where you don't need to consume all the time. Typically, if you're having to eat multiple times a day, it's because of this, not because of this. And getting used to eating once or twice a day, 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day, somewhat in advance, is part of being a carnivore. And there are some folks that eat every other day. And that's fine. Because bang for buck, you're getting an enormous amount of nutrition in, which is both calories and nutrients, that you don't have to replenish that very often. So not eating for protracted periods of time is absolutely fine. And when you do eat, still listen to your body. Those are critically important things. The next thing to understand, and this
actually, can I just go ask a question about that? So, you know, I think that's a really key point to point out, because I think a lot of us have this assumption about how much we should be eating. And when you really go by appetite, especially in the beginning, like that amount can actually be quite small. So that's okay. I just want to get clear from you.
It's absolutely fine. So, you know, from a nutritional perspective, forget about calories. From a nutritional perspective, we probably need the equivalent of about 2 eggs a day, 2 chicken eggs a day to sustain our nutritional needs. It's not a lot. It's not a lot. Now, let's segue a little bit, particularly for the African American community. Or let me go one step further. For people that come genetically from the tropics, a visual genetic picture is often something called lipedema. And genetically, historically, evolutionarily, people that come from warm climates tend to store their weight from the waist down. And that is an entity we call lipedema, and it's very common amongst my patients who can trace some of their ancestry back to Africa, that central portion of Africa, the warmer climes of Africa. That weight is incredibly difficult to get rid of. In fact, if you go back, I'm from South Africa, and there's a group of people that are still hunter-gatherers in large part in Africa, in South Africa, called the Khoisan, or the old Bushmen. They used to be called Bushmen, but now the true traditional name is Khoisan. And they have a particular demographic or visible body shape, very skinny at the top, and particularly the women have large buttocks and large thighs. That is where they store their fat. If you watch how little they eat and yet survive with that huge deposit of fat, because that is what made us successful as a species, that we could survive for weeks at a time without energy consumption. And genetically, the human body is super protective of that fat deposit. So in order to lose that weight, you have to eat a pathetically small amount of food, unimaginably small in this country, and very, very seldom. If I go back home and I look at what those folks eat traditionally, it is less than a starter in this country. So we've got to understand some of those genetics as well, and either accept that as long as my upper body's good and my blood work is good, I'm going to have some shape where it may not be fashionable to have that shape, but genetically that's who I am. Or say, hey, that fat is not bothersome fat. Lipedema, stage 1 and stage 2, is really a genetic survival part rather than anything else. When the upper body
actually, I was going to ask about that just to clarify. So lipedema, I thought, was a disease that, I mean, that you could have very painful fat, you could have a lot of stuff going on. So is it in stage 1 and stage 2 not really a big deal? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Or?
So,
Okay.
right, lipedema, Lipedema, is a genetic deposit of fat from basically the upper part of the legs to the buttocks. And there's a survival advantage to accumulating some fat there. Lipedema stage 3 and 4 is associated with obesity, where now you're depositing fat everywhere, including your buttocks and your hips. And then that fat becomes lumpy and it compresses your lymphatics. So you can also potentially have swelling of your legs, fluid swelling. And so lipedema itself is not a disease.
Okay.
Okay? Lipedema is not a disease, but stage 3 and 4 is a disease. That's where it becomes
how do you get from 2 to 3? Is that because
chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption? Chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. You know, if you look at Eskimos, for example, hunter-gatherer Eskimos are fat, but they're not obese. In other words, that fat is a protective and a healthy layer. They're not sick. They're some of the healthiest people out there, and they're mostly carnivore. So you can accumulate fat under certain genetic conditions, but that fat is not harmful. Does that make sense? In other words, the fat. So this is an important concept to understand. The ability to make fat protects the human body from the scourge of sugar. Okay? So fat is not the enemy. It's how we make that fat that is problematic. And if we make that fat through a process called insulin resistance and chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, that fat is associated with a whole bunch of diseases. But hunter-gatherer lipedema, hunter-gatherer Eskimo or Inuit obesity, that's not unhealthy fat. That serves a biologic purpose in that environment. Does it make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, our society has pressurized us to conform to a certain model that may not necessarily be genetically appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, fortunately, you know, the tastes and times are changing. So many of us have been able to throw off that that pressure to be, just really emaciated. But
Right.
it is helpful to know that fat, at least below the waist, is, not necessarily harmful, and that we, there's not as much pressure to get that fat off.
Right. And the single best metric, you see, fat or weight is very visual, and it's very easily measured by stepping on a scale. The true metric of health versus disease when it comes to fat is your insulin. Your insulin and your C-peptide, which are blood tests that can readily be measured, but very few doctors measure it because we don't have a pill for it. But if you are insulin sensitive and you're still carrying some of that excess weight, unless it's early in the journey, if you've been fat adapted and insulin sensitive, that is a comfort level of fat that either you live with or you really, really struggle to get rid of. Does that make sense? In fact, I'm going to be giving a talk in a few weeks' time to the Lipoedema Society on exactly that concept. That you really want to look at your blood numbers to understand your level of disease. Don't judge somebody based upon their look as to whether they're diseased or not. And in fact, the bizarre thing is that the fattest people are often at least of all people that eat carbohydrates, the fattest people are often the healthiest because they can very readily convert that sugar to fat. It's when you stop being able to produce fat that you get yourself into trouble. Because the trouble comes from the buildup of sugar either in your bloodstream or in your cells. And the beauty about a carnivore diet is you don't even have to ask questions. There really isn't any sugar in a carnivore diet with two prerequisites. Number one, on a carnivore diet, the food that you eat should have been alive. In other words, if you're drinking protein shakes and you're taking amino acids and you're adding MCT oil to, don't do that. Don't do that. Get your food from where God and nature made it. Improving on what God and nature did is probably not in our best interest. We seldom improve on what God and nature made us to consume. The second thing is never be afraid of fat or salt. Humans have chased fat for our entire existence except the last 70 years. Humans have chased salt our entire existence except in the last 70 years, when we maligned fat and we bowed down to the commercial god of sugar. So we really have to reverse those trends if we want to understand what's going on. And if you look at just a simple little statistic, the 220,000 people that have died in this country at minimum of COVID so far, especially in the African American community, which is heavily skewed by percentage in that death rate. The majority of the people that die of COVID are actually dying because of carbohydrate toxicity. In other words, the likelihood you're going to have a bad outcome when you get COVID is most directly based upon chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption and the consequence of insulin resistance. A lot of people get COVID and they don't get awfully sick from it. I still wouldn't want you to get COVID. But this is also a time when we really should empower ourselves to be as healthy as we can be and to be as free as we can be of those diseases. And the simplest, easiest way to do that is to eat carnivore.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're all on board with that message. So many of us have really tried to get family members and stuff to not eat sugar. I just, even as just a matter of keeping your immune system up. I mean, sugar has an immediate impact on your immune system. Is that correct?
Correct, absolutely. So what it does is carbohydrates activate the inflammatory system. And the inflammation is acellular and cellular. It's a combination of the two. And if your immune system is hyperfunctional, just as part of your background day, it's not going to have the sensitivity to react to other things coming in as readily. It's like distracted driving. It's like texting while you're driving. That's what you're doing to your immune system. Now, the flip side of that is an overactive immune system in a large number of people, especially high insulin producers, and we can discuss that in a second. That immune system often cross-reacts with things that may seem normal or natural. And we call that autoimmune disease. And one of the commonest forms of autoimmune disease is Hashimoto's disease, which is a low thyroid disease. And that also affects metabolic rate and a variety of other things. So autoimmune disease, and you mentioned that earlier on, is very, very likely tied to a high insulin producing person that consumes a lot of carbohydrates. Now, you don't get better right away, but slowly over time you improve. The risk of cancer is also directly influenced by a lack of fat and too much carbohydrate and immune surveillance. Our immune system has a surveillance system looking for abnormal cells, whether they are a virus, a bacteria, or a cancer cell. That's what our immune system does. And if the immune system is not turned on correctly and is not focused on what it's doing, those cancer cells can grow, and we're forming abnormal cells all the time and killing them. It's when we lose the ability to kill them that breast cancer rates. When I was in medical school, breast cancer was a very rare disease. Now it's by far the commonest disease in women. Colon cancer has gone through the roof. And it's primarily because of our diet. And not only the diet itself, but the bacteria that come along with that diet, because that's the other part that we haven't talked about yet, is the additional value of a carnivore diet is that the type of bacteria and funguses and viruses that human beings have in their intestine is defined by the bacteria that come along with what they eat. And vegetarian type bacteria are great for a cow because they help it to break down and extract energy from vegetables. They're designed that way. We human beings have lost the capacity to use vegetable-based bacteria and viruses to process our food. So when those vegetable-based bacteria process food in our colon, and the colon doesn't absorb food at all, it can only absorb and secrete salt and water. So now when you've got all this vegetable debris sitting in your colon and you've got the bacteria breaking it down, the metabolites of that are very likely the primary triggers of the scourge of colon cancer, of diverticulitis. So people tell us to eat more fiber to fix diverticulitis. I would tell you quite the opposite. Your diverticulitis comes from fiber. And then you get all these people that are, and again, this is the dollar addiction that's promoting this, all these people that are saying you have to take probiotics. Well, almost all of the probiotics are plant-based. So they're reinforcing a vegetarian type existence for people who are primarily carnivores. Don't take probiotics, eat a steak.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I know I've just kind of rambled on over there, but there are so many parts that are subtly important in terms of eating the diet we are biologically designed to consume to be the best we can be. And we
Well,
strayed.
sorry, but I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Well, so, one of the questions that I had come in from somebody in my community was, is fasting necessary or not for weight loss? And is it necessary to resolve autoimmune disorders and increase longevity and that sort of thing?
Okay.
Mhm.
So fasting is not necessary. But the caveat to that is not eating is important. What do I mean by that? We've got to understand why we eat. And if you've got diseases related to your diet, it is almost always because you overeat in terms of frequency, consistency of the food, the type of food that you eat, and the reason why you eat. So I eat once a day. But that doesn't mean I'm fasting for 23 hours. It means I'm dining in. The whole premise of eating is you consume food in a short period of time as a human being. That's why we have the advantage of a carnivorous diet. You can eat a huge bang for your buck in a short period of time. Your body, under the influence of insulin, distributes that food to your stores, and then for a long period of time, 16, 18, 23, 48 hours, you can live on that store. And then when you need to replenish that store, you eat again. That's what carnivores do. I don't call that fasting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you are biologically very disturbed, and especially with type 2 diabetes, and this is where Jason's methodology came in, and you're not willing to part from your carbohydrates, then prolonged fasts have asset value. But they do not have asset value except as the Girl Scout badge for people who are otherwise adopting this as a lifestyle. I did a 72-hour fast a month ago, and I felt great, and it made me feel good, and it bought me some time because you don't realize how much time you spend eating. But it didn't, fireworks didn't go off. It wasn't this. It was just an accomplishment that was actually so easy to do because I'm already fat-adapted carnivore. But I think we've oversold prolonged fasts as part of being human. But I think also we eat way too often.
Yeah, I mean, to hear your description of the caisson, is that what you called them? That that they eat that infrequently and that small of an amount of food is that's actually really surprising. And I guess that would be a really hard sell in America.
Right, it's the question. Now, the easiest thing for an American to understand this, if you've ever been to Europe, think about how pissed off you get that they're charging this ridiculous price for a kiddie's portion. The reality is that is how much we probably should eat, and it's us that have way overbought into portions.
Right.
And therein lies the problem. So, the beauty about a carnivore diet, and it's the beauty about it, plus also the frustration of it. I know, for example, tonight when I'm done with all the work, I'm going to have a ribeye steak. And it's my first meal of the day, and it's going to be a big-ass ribeye steak. The cow's going to sit down on my plate. And you know what? I'm going to eat about a third of it, and I'm going to be full. And I call that, if you watch some of my videos, that's called eating sequentially. I'm going to have little bits, and as soon as I begin to feel full, I'm done. But the beauty is, I'll have more ribeye tomorrow night. And then my dog may get some as well. So but returning to eating when we feel full, rather than preordaining how much we should eat, is a large part of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we've got plenty of stores. By the way, one other concept that's just important to understand is the human body in the ideal circumstances is designed to use two fuel sources, mostly fat and a little bit of sugar, but only enough sugar that can be produced internally. That's why we don't have to consume sugar. But the human body is not designed to use protein as a primary fuel source. Okay? If you look at a fat molecule, it's called a triglyceride. It's got three fatty acid chains and a molecule called glycerol that joins them together. And between meals, when you're not eating, the fat cells, your fat, releases that to the liver, and the liver breaks that apart. The glycerol component becomes sugar, and the fatty acids become ketones or are released as fatty acids. So you've got fat as your primary fuel and sugar as a little bit of fuel. So the human body can store small amounts of sugar as glycogen. It can store enormous amounts of fat, but the human body has zero capacity to store protein. And one of the problems with the carnivore novelists, the newbies to carnivore, is it is not unrestricted permission to overeat lean meat. So the phrase I use is always protect your meat with fat. And if you're eating a decent amount of fat with your meat, with your protein, the fat will tell you when you've had enough and it won't let you overeat the protein. But if you're eating a fillet, if you're just eating the chicken breast, if you're eating that muscular game fish, the tuna without anything else on it, you can way overeat and your liver is going to turn that excess into sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, ask any type 1 diabetic who eats a fillet steak, 2-3 hours later, their blood sugar's going up. And so it's so important that we understand that protein is not the focus. The focus is fat, and protein comes along for the ride. We need very, very little protein. So for those of you that are saying, I'm on a carnivore diet, and you're drinking your protein shakes, and you're eating your amino acids, that is not in your best interest. And if you see your blood sugar going up, if you see your diabetes not getting better, if you see your weight not moving, it's probably overeating protein because you've given yourself permission to overindulge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually really helpful, because I do hear from quite a few people that they struggle with, digesting protein or digesting fat, or still having acid reflux, which, maybe has to do with having the gastric bypass surgery or some of the bariatric surgery. So it sounds like what you're suggesting is just eat smaller meals and, maybe eat more often if you need to, but probably not. Just eat smaller meals.
I would say the opposite. I would say eat less often, but eat till you're full and recognize when you are full. Don't preordain how much you think you need to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? No animal species does that. But from the day we were fed, whether it was with a bottle as a baby, somebody told mom how much needs to go in that bottle, and come hell or high water, if you're a good mom, that baby's going to finish that bottle. When a baby's on a breast, the baby decides how much it's going to drink. But then we put food in front of the baby, and all the dietitians have told us, this is how much you need. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows how much you need, but your body knows. Same thing with drinking water.
But if your stomach has been artificially, augmented or changed, then can you still go by those same signs?
Absolutely. So with my bariatric population, that's where, especially if they have very small stomachs. First of all, the purpose, when they're still heavy, the purpose is to stop eating. So you want to reformat that. But even if you're a few years out and you're metabolically healthy, you will never undereat unless you can't eat. And I have an issue with what I call the metabolic surgeries, where you eat, but you poop it all out. That's great for calories, but it's not a good idea for the rest of your life from a metabolic perspective. So I prefer surgeries that restrict how much you can eat. But even under those conditions, it's very rare that someone who's had bariatric surgery needs to eat more than twice a day. The value of being carnivore is you get a much bigger bang for your buck. You have to eat a hell of a lot of lettuce to get anything in. But if you eat a steak, if you eat some liver, if you eat any animal product, you're getting an enormously dense amount of nutrition in. And you really don't need a huge amount. Now, if you're this big, I if you're either Urkel or an Olsen twin, then we can talk about under eating. But until then, not necessary.
But are there ever signs that a person's under eating, like being, more irritable or tired or not energized, or do you think that's coming from something else?
No, it's definitely coming from something else. And the most common reason why that happens, including reactive hypoglycemia, is hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance, because insulin blocks your access to your fat cells. The first thing insulin does is it blocks fat mobilization, because you don't want to deal with the carriers in your bloodstream and have your fat cells put more in. So remember, when you're fasting, when you're not eating, insulin does not control your blood sugar directly. Insulin controls glucagon that controls your blood sugar. And when glucagon levels are elevated, they're saying to your fat cells, hey, give me, and you're releasing fat from your fat stores. But if you're insulin resistant and your insulin levels are high all the time, you can't mobilize fat. And then you get hungry as soon as you run out of food. And if your blood sugars are kind of doing this up and down, every time they drop because of insulin, you get hungry. That's the cycle we break on a ketogenic and a carnivore diet, where you want your blood sugar pretty much flat, or just maybe a little wavy, but pretty much flat, so you don't feel hungry. And that's the principle we're looking for. Does that make sense?
So like the person who is like cheating from time to time and, maybe twice a week or something like that, and kind of going off and on, that person is going to have tons of cravings because of that blood sugar being
absolutely. And they'll get what we call reactive hypoglycemia. So if you just eat a little bit, you produce a lot of insulin, and it gets rid of that sugar very quickly, and your blood sugar plummets because of the overdose with insulin. Ask any type 1 diabetic. Halle Berry, for example, I saw you had something on her a while ago. Halle Berry is a type 1, and if she overdoses, she feels like crap. It's the same way when you eat a little bit of sugar, especially highly concentrated sugar. Your insulin overreacts, your blood sugar plummets, and you feel terrible because you've overdosed on insulin. And the way to correct that, you ask any diabetic, is to eat sugar, which is exactly what you don't want to do.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas even if you convert excess protein to fat, to sugar, it's a slow, steady rise. It's not a spike. And that's what you're trying to get away from.
Yeah.
And that's
now,
the biology.
in terms of, Go ahead.
No, I'm good.
And so in terms of like fatty foods and getting fatty meats, some people, depending on what part of the country they're in, have difficulty doing it. I mean, for me in New York, finding fatty meat is just so hard. It's trimmed to death. So, some people have to rely on butter. I've been ordering tallow so that I can just add it. What do you recommend for people, or is that an issue?
No, I think it is an issue. First of all, in my own life, because of my patient population, I try to eat for under $10 a day. Money should never be a reason you don't do a carnivore diet. A Big Mac, fries, and costs more than what I spend on food in a day. Now, ideally, you should be eating, or the ideal is to eat grass-fed organic beef. But the reality is, if you go to Walmart and you buy whatever's on sale, which I do, it's still a hell of a lot better than eating a pizza. So don't be perfectionistic. If you can afford to be, do it. But you don't have to be perfectionistic in terms of the origination of your food. That's the first thing. The second thing is, even if you can't or don't like, a lot of people just don't like very fatty food. Find things, I call them my 5 fat friends. Find things that you can use as a condiment to increase the fat content. So, and I know that you're a little bit stricter than this, but I use cheese, I use bacon, I use butter, I use ghee. I even use olive oil, coconut oil, and avocado oil as condiments to increase the fat content of what I'm eating. And the two things that I'll always do when I'm eating, I put my food in the middle of the table, I have an empty plate, I dish some food up, and if it's a big fatty ribeye, I'm going to eat that. But if it's a little bit of a leaner piece of meat, I may add some butter, and I'm always adding salt. And the value of that is it slows me down, so I eat less before I am full. Because if I attack a steak like a Rottweiler having breakfast, I can have a massive quantity in the time it takes my hormones to tell my brain I'm full. So, and that's an important metric. But if you slow down, if you eat a little bit slower, you'll feel equally full on a lower caloric volume. And if you spend a bit of time putting some salt on your food, if you spend a bit of time cutting your food up with a knife and fork and maybe adding some fat to it, you feel full with a much smaller quantity. And if weight loss is your game, that's the way to lose calories and yet feel full. Because the worst thing you can do is to live under conditions of starvation.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So this has been like really amazing. I really appreciate your coming on and, having this conversation with me. You've, answered a ton of questions and, it's really been helpful. So can people continue to reach out to you and ask you questions? Because I know I hit some of the ones that, people wanted to know, but I would love to hear, I'd love to make sure that I can, connect people with you if they have further questions.
Absolutely. So I've got a whole YouTube channel. It's Carb Addiction Doc, and there's tons of videos that discuss all of this stuff. And it really helps you to understand how you got to be where you are and what the important aspects are. Sometimes we place too much importance on the unimportant. So it quantifies that. And people may argue with things. There may be differences of opinion, but that YouTube channel is excellent. Please subscribe. It's for free. And the YouTube videos drop twice a week. I'm on Instagram every day. We put out a little comment on Instagram. For example, today's one was about mental health in schools and that we don't teach kids about mental health. I mean, kids are committing suicide at ridiculous rates. They're all vaping. Obesity demographic is the largest in 2 to 5 year olds. And yet the one thing, so we give them a ton of drugs, but we don't teach them effective mental health skills. And it just
what's the relationship between sugar and mood? Because I know my mood changed dramatically once I took out sugar, and I became like more emotionally resilient and happy and just, even tempered.
Absolutely. There's no question that sugar is a drug, not a food. And we use it as such. So Instagram, I'm also on Facebook. The stuff posts on Facebook, same channel, but I'm not very active there. I just don't have the time. And then if anybody wants to set up a visit, I'm obviously a doctor. I do bariatric surgery, but I also do a ton of coaching, carnivore, keto. We do insulin numbers. We do all the blood work. So if you're interested in that, we do CAC scores. We didn't even touch on that. We look at all of those things. And especially if your doctor is pressurizing you that you have to take a statin. It's ludicrous that when you eat fat, that you have to reduce the fat in your bloodstream. That's like taking the gasoline out of your car and saying my car's running too well. Sorry, it just boggles my mind. But if you're wrestling with your doctor, that's a very useful place to get information from us. And the way to get a hold of us there is if you text 561-517-0642. That's called our bat phone, and leave a message, and we'll get back to you and set up that appointment. It can be a bit of a struggle to get in to see us because we're just chock-a-block full, but we can make it happen. And thank you so much for what you do. I mean, you really are doing an amazing job of not just demographically, but humanistically. And that's the demographic I look at, is saying, this is what we need to be able to do, and here's why it works, despite what everybody else is telling us. And that's very difficult. If all the experts say one thing, And we're standing there saying, well, that's not true. That's problematic. But I've been trying to knock holes in this for 21 years, and I just haven't been able to. The number of people I have taken off their diabetic medication far exceeds any endocrinologist who never take their patients off their diabetic medications because they're still diabetic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Same thing with blood pressure.
Yeah.
Same thing with so many medications.
Yeah.
Even thyroid medications, the autoimmunes. So if that's what people are interested in, to know a little bit more about how they work and to be able to identify why they got into the trouble and what it is that they need to do to move forward, that's the kind of conversation we have.
That sounds great. And I think that would really be helpful for people. So I'm definitely going to let people know, I'll put it in the description, that, you know, that number, and make sure that people can, you know, try to reach out to you, because it's, you know, sometimes, you know, there's a lot of transition symptoms, and, you know, some of these things are just, it just takes time, and you just got to, you know, struggle through. And then other things, I think there probably would be, it would be helpful to have, you know, some medical intervention. So I definitely want to encourage some people to come reach out to you. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, because we've been doing this for such a long time, there are mistakes that people are still going to be making in their journey that we've made and solved years ago. So it's always better to learn from other people's mistakes rather than your own. And there are so many pitfalls that I see that red light going off, and I say, okay, you can either hear what we have to say, or, and I don't have all the answers by any means, but certainly we've seen all the mistakes out there, and we have a way around them or through them so that you don't trap yourself in the same mistakes.
Wow. Well, maybe I'll have to make some effort to get in to see you too. I mean, I have to say, even though I've been doing this, I'm almost at 3 years of doing this, you know, that I really have seen quite a dramatic difference for my eczema by taking out coffee and spices, and, you know, and just really getting strict with it. So you know, I thought that might be true, but I just didn't want it to be. And then once I got much stricter, I felt something different.
And what I tell people,
and also for me, removing dairy.
Yeah, do the experiment. If you have a problem and something works, but you're going to be super careful about assigning blame to things, causality to things that are not necessarily causal. So it's so important to understand that side of things. You know, we do a whole thing on oxalates, and carnivore obviously excludes oxalates very readily. But oxalates, and this is the bizarre part, and we haven't even touched on this, the majority of oxalates come from protein.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when everybody stands up there and says, oh, they come from vegetables. So you can measure oxalates in your vegetables, but it's not necessarily true that those are the ones that cause kidney stones and cause damage to our joints and things. It is misuse of protein that is as harmful as some of those vegetable materials that we eat. And uric acid and oxalic acid, I've got 2 videos on that those as an issue. So we've got to understand.
And you think that carnivores can have a tendency to overeat protein just because we as Americans just eat, you know, a lot.
You see, what does carnivore mean? Carnivore means we eat animals and animal products. It doesn't mean we eat protein. And we have to get away from the words protein and even fat, and just say we eat what we have evolved to eat. And I know we're going over now, but the single most important defining aspect of being human is our brain. And the human brain is almost all fat. And without adequate fat in our diet, we are taking an evolutionary step backwards or sideways. And if you look at autism rates, if you look at dementia, Alzheimer's, in large part, it's a lack of adequate animal fat in our diet. And that's a big, big problem. So I look at eating carnivore means I eat animals and animal products according to what my ancestors evolved to eat. And that for me is one of the keys, is that if you break that down and divide it up into little segments and try to put it in pill and supplement form, you may not necessarily be doing yourself a lot of benefit. And too much
So
of the good.
we could be relying too heavily on lean meat, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. You know, when the nephrologists all say don't eat a lot of protein because it causes kidney damage, they're absolutely right. But it doesn't mean you don't have to eat meat. But if you're eating your little filet steak and your little denuded chicken, white chicken breast without the skin, yeah, you're going to cause problems for yourself. If you're just eating egg whites, that's problematic because all the nutrients are in the yolk. Eat the whole animal and as close to whole animals as you can, or eat the whole bulk of that muscle or wherever it is. That's where the healthy part is. You know, I'm from Africa. Lions don't go through there and cut the fat off the animal and just nibble on the lean meat. They go for the fattest parts of that animal right away.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not.
I do that too.
Right,
I love the fat.
Exactly. So you know, we can go on forever, and I know I've kind of gone and then gone forward. So there's plenty to discuss. And one of the key things is just keep it simple. If it's complicated, it's probably not right.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. I really do appreciate this. It means a lot that you came on here and we had this opportunity to talk. And I'm going to get this up as soon as possible. So hopefully, you know, people will find value in this and it'll answer some of the questions that have been going around. And thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate what you do. And it makes such an important impact when you've got somebody talking about a footprint. And that's really what we're doing. We're creating footprints that other people can be attracted to and at least try and at least experiment. See what it does for you and see where it goes. But we desperately need more of you. So thank you very much.